I've always said, somewhat as a joke, somewhat seriously, that I'd be really sad if I never got to see the end of Doctor Who. It's weird for me to think about a time where Doctor Who wasn't on our screens as someone who's essentially never known life without Doctor Who. But it's not going to last forever, not as we know it anyway. Let's turn the clocks back a little bit. The 60s and the 70s were extreme highs for Doctor Who. In the 60s there was barely any competition, and the show really hit its stride in the 70s. Doctor Who's popularity was just constantly rising, and it was always able to consistently find what audiences wanted. It was just in the 80s when the show became too familiar and was eventually axed before the 90s came around. By that time, low-budget sci-fi TV and bigger-budget films had made strides in the genre that meant Doctor Who just couldn't keep up. 16 years later, in the mid-noughties, it was rebooted in a more modern style, and since then many shows have reached and arguably surpassed the cultural and televisual significance it held when it came back. I would argue that the same thing has somewhat happened again, and that the science fiction landscape has changed so much that Doctor Who has to adapt, otherwise it's going to repeat the failures of the 80s. Now, I'm not saying that Doctor Who hasn't changed since 2005, nor am I saying it's gotten any worse, that's up to you. But I'm just wondering, how long can this run go? People have always drawn parallels between classic and new Who, comparing doctors such as Christopher Eccleston to Jon Pertwee, David Tennant to Tom Baker, Matt Smith to Peter Davison, Peter Capaldi to Colin Baker, nearly forgot one there. Although this would make Jodie Whittaker's tenure comparable to Sylvester McCoy's, and from what I can tell, the show didn't end with Jodie Whittaker. As much as I love Russell T Davies for bringing back Doctor Who in 2005 and his series with Eccleston and Tennant, did we really need him back? Was it genuinely impossible to find someone new with a new style to push Doctor Who forward? It's not enough to keep riding the nostalgic writing of his era anymore. Again, I'm not saying that Russell T Davies hasn't changed his style since 2005, of course he has, that's how writers work. But you can't tell me he wasn't hired simply due to his success with the show nearly 2 decades ago. That's a long time ago. As much as Chris Chibnall's era has been hounded by many, I really appreciated him trying to do something different, and it would be wrong to say that he absolutely failed in all aspects. A tenure as long as Doctor Who's modern run these days is pretty much an anomaly when looking at the broader TV landscape. If we look at some other long-running modern fiction dramas that aren't like soaps, we get stuff like Criminal Minds, Silent Witness, Law and Order, Supernatural. If it's not ended already, it wouldn't be far-flung to assume that it will end soon and not leave much of an impact on the TV landscape. Could Doctor Who be receiving this same fate eventually? So let's assume that Doctor Who will end this decade. Whether it ends with Russell T Davies or Ncuti Gatwa, I'm not that interested in. What I would love to know is, what would the final story or final stories or final arc be? Assuming the production team knew far enough in advance, you would hope that they'd kind of plan for something big. You know, the Day of the Doctor kind of culminated like an 8-year storyline about the Time War. Obviously, they'd have not as much. They wouldn't be planning for 8 years for the end of the show, I would imagine. But hopefully, they could have a few years to plan an ending for the show instead of something like the Day of the Doctor, which was obviously a massive success. Would they try something like the Timeless Children and try and reinvent the Doctor Who lore as we know it in like one episode? Or would they actually kind of do something like that across a few seasons? The Time of the Doctor also comes to mind. They could have fleshed something like that out. You know, I don't know if a whole season of the Doctor on Trenzalore would have been very good for a final season, but it could have been interesting. Obviously, I'm not saying they should revisit these stories, just that they had the hallmarks of what could be an okay ending to the show. Honestly, all the Guardians of the Edge stuff from The Power of the Doctor was pretty solid too, for like the ending of the Doctor's life. However, I think that if Doctor Who ever was to get a planned ending and it wasn't just going to show up a decade and a half later, I would want something a bit more low-key. Explore a bit more of what makes the Doctor, why they've lived their life, and why it has to end. Or, you know, don't have to kill the Doctor off, obviously. I'm not saying end as in end their life, but end their adventures. The easy thing to do would be to have some big sacrificial moment that saves the universe but then stops the Doctor from having adventures. Whether that kills them off or not, again, I'm not sure. Perhaps it'd be interesting to see the Doctor slowly realise that they're not needed anymore. They've influenced so many people throughout time and space that they are essentially doing their job for them. They have spread their moral virtues throughout time and space, and the stories of them kind of live on in through generations. So their friends and their companions will kind of spread the word of the Doctor and all the good things that they've done, but also work themselves. You know, obviously we've got Torchwood, we've got the Sarah Jane Adventures, but we know that the Doctor's had companions from other planets and literally like stories that have influenced planets and how they've evolved through the Doctor, from that girl from The Good Man Goes to War, obviously kind of impacting them in a bit of a wrong way there. But if the Doctor was able to realise that they're not important anymore, that their work is done, then we could have them make the choice to stop adventuring, I suppose. The Doctor would no longer be an integral cog in the universal machine, and because the Doctor is more human than they realise, they might be able to find peace in that. They might be able to find a resting place. I mean, it really depends on like what your kind of view of the Doctor is. No one's perfect ending is going to be the same as someone else's. I change my kind of thoughts on what I think the Doctor means in the show like basically every other week. Stephen Moffat, I feel, has tried to explore that kind of stuff the most with the Doctor's morality and why the Doctor makes certain decisions and stuff like that. Like I think it was really interesting intertwining the moral choices that Doctor makes with like all the stuff with Gallifrey and stuff. It can get quite convoluted at times, but what they would need to do is really pinpoint the Doctor in one kind of word, one kind of motive, and then do something that kind of has a slow burn in a sense of, you know, quite a few seasons or stories to cover that. I am not a showrunner by any means, so I might just be talking out my arse, but I think it would be more interesting than having something like The Time of the Doctor or The Timeless Children that just kind of throws it at you, even if it was good or if it was bad. Like, it would be much more interesting to kind of explore the Doctor in a more intimate way than we have before. Whether we'd like it to or not, Doctor Who will realistically never end. It will always continue in other mediums like books or comics or audio stories. When Big Finish started in 1999, it really showed that Doctor Who had never left the public's subconscious. It's always going to be a part of, well, I'd say British DNA, but it is so international that the show will always continue. There's always going to be a dedicated set of fans creating content for Doctor Who, no matter how small that be. I'd love to hear how you think Doctor Who will end, whether it's too ingrained in our culture or not changed enough for modern audiences to care anymore. I just hope that whoever's job it is to close off Doctor Who's history doesn't do something unnecessarily massive and change the already detailed and established lore, and try and instead take a look at what Doctor Who means and do something that respects what came before.